As Book 2 of Paradise Lost begins, we are continuing with the fall of Satan and his followers from heaven. There's not many that there's not that many new characters that are introduced. Some are brought to light, but the main ones that were introduced in Book 1 are continuing in their situation as Book 2 begins. There is a debate in Pandemonium, and Pandemonium is the state um, of where Satan and his followers are existing at this time. It is a chaotic state, and this also happens to be a word that Milton created, meaning chaos, and it is something that over time we have incorporated it into our vernacular and our vocabulary to use to mean the very state. So, what you think of as pandemonium, utter chaos, is what these characters are experiencing at this time. There's the introduction of Satan presiding over the debate being what are we going to do now? We are here, the situation is terrible. What's our next step? And book 2 goes through the different speeches of the different fallen angels, Moloch, Belial, Mammon, then their reactions, and then Beelzebub's speech. They each have something different that they bring to the table. And the conclusion is that someone must go to Earth that has already been created and try to figure out what to do next. So Satan volunteers for that mission. So there is an account of all of the fallen angels' pastimes in Satan's absence, and then Satan's journey out of hell, meetings with sin, death, and chaos. And each of these um, situations or characters or beings here, sin, death, or experiences have been personified into characters here. So, looking at Moloch's speech, Milton describes Satan's exalted state as president of proceedings. Satan explains how, as none wishes to take on his suffering, none will wish to dispute his leadership, and he calls for speakers. So, we get Moloch's speech, and Moloch wants open warfare, has no fear of death, doesn't want to stay in hell. If they have nothing to lose, then why not fight? So his whole idea is, if we're already as bad as we can be, why else should we not fight? If God destroys them, it would be better than living where they currently are now. If they can't be destroyed, then how could their situation get any worse? If these characters are immortals, then there's nothing else that can get any worse. So even if they fail to destroy God, threatening heaven's peace would be a revenge in itself. So this is a character who's obviously carrying a lot of anger. Belial and Mammon's speech, they are motivated by sloth or laziness rather than reason. They counter Moloch's argument and worries that a second attempt could lead to a harder punishment. Basically, if God did this to us the first time and we can't die, how much more could he do to us this time? So Mammon's speech reacts to it and points out that they can't dethrone God until chaos regains the rule of things. His argument is that they should just enjoy being accountable to no one. Let's just stay here. Things aren't going to get any worse. They're not going to get any better, but they're not going to get any worse. And they should try to make hell like a new heaven. And that's something to follow, that theme there, making hell like a new heaven. And most devils are pleased at the thought of not waging war because, in the end, they are all just cowards. Then Beelzebub, with his speech, begins to call on all the demons, the princes of hell. So basically, trying to make their state a little more glorified, a little more dignified, argues that if they decide to stay in hell, it will ultimately prove to be their dungeon, and suggests that mere war or peace is unacceptable. Something's got to be done. He begins to outline the story of creation of a new world and of man. And with doing this, remember that our story begins in medias res, in the middle. How did we get here? So along the way, we're going to get pieces of the story of how they came to be in this current fallen state. So, going back, we're going to get how creation came to be. He suggests that investigating the new world to find a way to spoil or weaken it, and they all agree that they should then try to infiltrate the new world. But who will take on this new task? And then there's a biblical allusion to Revelations 1:11. And that's something that I do encourage you, that anytime there are the biblical revelation or um, allusions to different parts of Genesis or Revelation, First Timothy, that you do go and look these up to see the connections that are made there. Beelzebub, in his speech, sin is compared to Scylla, to the waist, a maiden she with comely fashioned breast, her after part a seething monster sized with dolphin tails on wolfish belly fixed. And that is an allusion to Virgil's The Aeneid in Book 3, um, with Scylla being one of the multi-headed monsters that Odysseus and Aeneas had to pass by. And keep in mind that sin in this book is basically the daughter of Satan. She has sprung from his head as an evil thought, and that is very much in the same way as Athena was created. And it's interesting to note that Athena, the goddess of wisdom, sprung from the head of Zeus, and then thus she was created. And in the same way, sin, like a thought of Satan, sprung from his head. Satan continues his speech here, admits to the dangers for anyone who goes to the New World, admits that he would not deserve to be their leader if he didn't agree to go. So here is a very sneaky way that Satan is trying to weave in his master like in his own mind features, because the fallen angels must have someone who is going to act as their savior. So of course Satan is going to volunteer for this job. He is going to be this savior. So that is a very important theme to note throughout this book, that idea of a false savior being Satan versus the true savior being Christ, who is going to ultimately not just, quote, put his life in danger, but will give his life for his people, which is something that Satan would not be willing to do. The devil's pastimes, and these are just important things to note. While Satan prepares to begin his great adventure, the devils are free to occupy their time how they wish. Milton describes first how some play at war games on a colossal scale, how some amuse themselves with music, how others indulge in vain abstract of philosophical speculation, while yet others explore their dismal world but find in it nothing for their comfort. So again, they're trying to create a heaven in this hell. Satan does go on his expedition. He flies to the gates of hell, encounters sin and death, and convinces sin and death to open the gates so that they would be able to prey upon the creatures of the new world. Now, something else to look at: sin is the daughter of Satan, basically, that has sprung from his head, but death is the product of their consummation and relationship. So, death is the child of the incestuous relationship between sin and his daughter Satan, which is as terrible as it sounds. However, it was very creative on Milton's part, because that's basically how it was brought into being. Sin was a thought of Satan, and then death is the product of that sin. So naturally, their union would result in death. And then Satan flies toward the new world and arrives at chaos to see what new havoc he can wreak upon man.